All right, so hi everyone. So I'm a AI science fellow here. So I'm by no means an expert in medicine or biology, but I guess that's good because I'm going to ask very naive questions, which I think we're all sort of asking ourselves. And yeah, first of all, thanks for the amazing talks. I wanted to start with a kind of more speculative question about sort of the future of the field. So we all know about these huge breakthroughs in AI. So, AlphaFold, AlphaGo. So do you think that in your specific fields, there will be such of an epiphany moment like this? And if so, I'm thinking in medicine, maybe, some HIV treatments, maybe a new amazing material, I don't know, anything like this. Do you expect this to happen in the years to come?
Did you want? I guess so. AlphaFold is interesting because that was a known problem for 50 years, right? So I think if you want to focus on something in medicine that's been a known problem for a long time, I would say new mechanisms for treating diseases. So just I don't know if this is necessarily a grand challenge yet, but induced proximity is a new way of trying to treat certain diseases and is a difficult design challenge. And that would be a great opportunity where we have some data and a clear problem. If we could make new drugs for induced proximity as a new mechanism, that would be a whole new set of treatments for oncology, and maybe be a cure for cancer.
Yeah, maybe treatment of cancer and Biomedical, which is less studied. There are many neglected diseases for which the data even is scarce and sparse. And to Andrew's point, new mechanism for finding target, for finding molecules that interacts with the target and inhibits. I think we have a long way to go. And going back to the protein structure prediction problem, I think when AlphaFold was announced, it was portrayed in some media news as that the folding problem is solved. Going back to that, folding problem has yet to be solved. And we can even consider that as the next grand challenge.
I remember when AlphaGo was streamed, and I came up with an idea then of what I would stream, which is I have this vision of the best radiologists in the world getting together and then an AI model. And this would be live telecast where they'd get the most difficult cases, and then you would see how the radiologists do it and how the model does it. And then finally you would see who wins. It'll be 5 games. Well, let's see who wins. So that's the vision. That's the breakthrough moment.
So I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way. For the mice in the audience, cancer will be cured. And I say that with a little bit of a jest. I mean, I at least got people's attention. Like, mice? What happened? So these technologies are, the pace at which they're moving is mind-blowing. And even by just sheer probability, yes, new things will come out of it. And where I feel we're going to get stuck is translating these discoveries into practice. I don't think our current clinical trial regime can keep pace with 100 new molecules a week. Like, we just don't have the infra, like organizationally, regulatory wise, to keep up. And so the thing that, it's a yes and no answer in the sense that yes, the science will advance, and just like theoretical physics is like 50 years ahead of experimental physics, we might find ourselves in that situation that a lot of things are possible, but we struggle to distribute them to the masses and reduce them to practice broadly.
Great, thanks. And yeah, related to this, would you expect that in years to come, the progress in these fields will be driven more by academia, industry, and interplay of the two? Because we can really see that, in LLM research, there's rather different roles. There's this sort of open source community, there's closed source models. How do you see this in medicine and chemistry?
I think the answer is both. Like, one of the like unfortunate threat that I'm seeing is that a lot of like things coming from academia that we don't have like resources to do the innovation. But I think some of the talks that was like we were like listening yesterday, I believe that there is a lot to happen like in the academic region. And the reason is that like definitely industry has like more power and more compute maybe in compared to academic world. But like at least for medicine, I can see that like academic people, they can move faster and they have like more resources to look at the problem more naturally through like less loopholes. And there are like a lot of fundamental like problem here that maybe industry is not like really interested in it. And those are the questions and problem that I think that the academic people that they need to answer them. That it doesn't like even need resources or like high computation power. And I think that's the way that it's gonna go. Like definitely industry gonna like develop and it's gonna like pull the share that they have. But I can see that like the academic world's also like gonna catch up, and we see that like there is a lot of development recently, past few months, in the open access LLMs that they can work on par with the models that they are like under the lock in industry section. And yeah, that's my answer and like my prediction.
I'll let the other speakers have a chance to go after this one.
Yeah, in my opinion, medicine and chemistry, both of these domains are tricky. It's a different thing that, we put a ChatGPT and we let the people interact with it. And if you just think the parallel, a medicine generator and tester in open domain and let people, test it behind mice. So I think, it's a whole different gameplay. And I think while the interaction between academia and industry and the governing bodies are very important here, I think industry is not just tech industry when it comes to medicine and chemistry. We are not just practitioner. We just don't know. Research science could be advanced, but in terms of practice, to Nigam's point, that it really needs very tight collaboration. Open is the way to go, but I don't know how much pharma is going to embrace open science and chemistry, chemical companies as well. But there is a lot of interest, a lot of work ongoing to integrate some of these new scientific advances in their business workflow, and it is possible through tight and hopefully open interaction.
Thanks. I think there are three kinds of resources that are required to do this work. There is compute, there's people, and there's data. I think we can think of all of those axes. So on the people axis, I think it's clear that the kind of work that we need to do is getting more and more interdisciplinary. I think a lot of the elements of generalist models will require human expert feedback, and then it will require iteration. So it's no longer you collect data once and then you build your models. And so there's a clean dichotomy between those two. That's just not going to be the case in the future. So it is places that appreciate this group of people coming together that I think makes a difference. Then you've got your compute. And obviously there's a bunch of people interested in getting the compute costs down. At the same time, it's clear that larger and larger models is the way to go. And then there are places that are investing efforts into saying, let's build central resources for academics to be able to train large models. And Stanford AMI being one of the places that's leading the charge there. And then data. And for data, people who have the data have an advantage and an opportunity to say, I'm going to develop infrastructure to be able to allow researchers to use that data. And there are a few places worldwide that are taking an active effort there. Mayo Clinic, Stanford, as two examples. While industry might struggle to then acquire that data from partners. One way to do it is to say, hey, let me license that data from you. But those are the three sort of fronts. And I think you can do that in academia, you can do that in industry. There has to be a recognition of how we get these resources of people, compute, and data to get this all to fit together.
So I'll answer it again slightly differently. Absolutely need people, data, and compute. Like without that, you can't manufacture the advances that we would need to then translate. But I'll plant in your head a triangle that we talked about briefly yesterday. There's the manufacturing of the model. Then there's the verifying of its benefit, and that got referred to by a couple of speakers today, that how do we test, what are our benchmarks, how do we convince ourselves it works? And then there's deployment. And I talked just about health IT systems, but think about deployment writ large. And what we need to solve for is the ecosystem. We might need to come up with new kinds of business entities. We might need to invent new legal structures. We might need to invent incentives to close the loop faster. Like today, there is zero incentive for a company like Google to give an academic like me early access to MedCom. In fact, there's a lot of disincentive to do that, because if something goes wrong, there'll be a lawsuit. Now, if we don't solve for those kinds of systemic barriers, we're just going to have a pileup of amazing advances in archive, and I call that stochastic archive descent, which will not translate into molecules that get injected into patients. And it's a real problem. And I think the science is accelerated, not accelerating. It has accelerated, but the ecosystem around medicine and health has not kept up. They're not even acknowledging the existence of the problem yet.
Thanks a lot for these answers. So one thing I'd like to mention now is that probably we can split this whole field of AI for science into maybe applications and discovery, basically doing stuff we already know how to do, but better or faster, and then really discovering new things. And I think we can all agree that we're getting there on the first aspect, like we can really do stuff we already know how to do very well. And the second aspect is kind of more difficult. We don't really know yet. And in each one of your talks, like this question arises, for example, in Pranav's talk, there's the question, so you presented this model which aligns these scans with a retrieval data set of diagnostics. In Payel's talk, you present like generation of new molecules. Can it generate like not only new molecules, but actually new families, like things which are really far from the data distribution? And then even like in Andrew's talk, like can the model answer questions where it doesn't have like the actual answer in internet somewhere? And more generally, do you think that, to answer the original question, these AI models are built for scientific discovery or just doing stuff we already know how to do?
Yes, I have staked my life right now on doing that, right? So I moved to San Francisco and joined a nonprofit focused on AI for discovery, and we're hiring biologists and building laboratories and compute. So yes, I think it's possible.
So you, in your model, it answers questions it's pretty well. So you said you started experimenting whether it can actually answer the questions where it doesn't have the answer on the internet. What is the sort of
So we have 230 million scientific papers. We answer questions from that. And that is not the agent. That is a tool. I haven't talked about the agent today, but if you wanted to have an agent that can do science, it needs to be able to ask questions of the literature, right? So what we've shown is just one tool where the tool itself is an agent. And so we're working towards, the larger process of the scientific method with agents.
I think the AI agents are ready to at least handle a few of the scientific discovery questions. But if we look into more, many or in general, the scientific discovery questions or use cases, there are typically multi-tier problem definition. So I would say that in the last few years we have made quite a lot of advances that these AI systems are now ready to handle the primary, secondary tier of this discovery use cases. But yeah, our AI models have invented, discovered new antibiotics, new SARS-CoV-2 inhibitors. Have they discovered a drug that can be used as antibiotic? No, not yet. Do we know how to do that? Yeah, given resources and a couple of years probably or less, maybe it's possible. But it needs that ecosystem, to pursue such big challenges. I think a lot of scientific advances have been made, but they are kind of stalled, and we really need to scale in terms of compute data, but also resource collaboration across different entities in order to handle those big global challenges that requires new discovery.
I think if we only realize the research potential and do not realize the application potential, it might be a disservice to our community writ large. There's a lot of things that are already programmed in the world, in the sense of, if we look at demographics, 2 billion people, a country of 2 billion people is going to age out into plus 65. 20 years later, another country with 1.5 billion people is going to do the exact same fate. That's half of humanity in the next 20 years that is going to cross the median age of 65. That is going to fundamentally reshape what we as society need to produce and provide. And those kinds of factors will create the incentives that drive the applications of whatever technology we come up with, language models being one of them. And those macro forces, we have to pay attention, because it's very hard or near impossible to push against incentives. Like healthcare data exchange in the US has been solved from a technology level for 25 years. It's an incentive problem, that's why nobody shares data. And so those kinds of barriers are the ones to worry about more.
Thanks. So I wanted to move a bit on the question of modality and generalism of these models. So we've kind of seen the emerging tendency that models tend to move from specialist to generalist, and also from unimodal to multimodal. Then at the same time, there are some counterexamples. I mean, for example, AlphaFold is like unimodal and very specialized. So like, how do you see this trend going? Like, do you think we're always going to continue moving in that direction, and should we?
So to answer your question, I think like we need generalist model definitely, and it wasn't there. So like, because that's a new trend, maybe we're gonna see it more. But like at some point, I predicted like maybe we're gonna end up at the interplay of like generalist model and a specialist model, because definitely from the technology side, we are still not capable of like handling a lot of this data in the same architecture for many reasons that we know, like such as sequence length, the token that we can feed, the type of data that we have, that they are like very large. And sometimes in those setups, maybe having a specialist model is much better. But the trend to go toward generalist model has a more I think like interesting a reason, and one of the reason was that like discovery thing. So we want to go to that direction to enable the discovery, but maybe in a real world setup to get it deployed to the world, maybe in a specialist model is going to work better based on the application that we want to target.
Yeah, this is probably, I mean, if you look at history, usually adding more modes, more data, more scale has always been the right answer. I think this is probably a mistake on my part, but I think that actually multimodal is not the way to go for generalist models. I think that multimodal is very important for search and retrieval, and I think that's not received that much attention, is that being able to pull up relevant information is important. I think reasoning is maybe not best for a multimodal agent. Maybe, but I'm not convinced yet it is necessary. Certainly for things like, I want to know what an image is and I want to ask a question about an image, I can see that being very important with multimodal things. But if I want to take an image and I want to know what is the chemical structure in the image, I would never trust a multimodal model to write down the smiles from a chemical structure. I would always use a deterministic program, or if I have, a paragraph of text, I don't know if I would trust the OCR on a multimodal model, depending on where the text came from. So I actually believe that there needs to be multiple models, some of them generalists, some of them specialists. Every time somebody has tried to build custom models, it's always been a mistake retrospectively. So I could be wrong, but that's what I'm thinking right now. But I think it's an open question.
On the notion of multimodal model for discovery, yeah, I have yet to be convinced. Maybe there are scenarios where you cannot go without multimodality. In terms of this generalist versus specialist, I think it's going to be more natural and organic conversion of one into the other going forward. I mean, we do see that, from a generalist model standpoint, using that as a starting point, you get to a specialist. So I think that's going to be natural and organic. Yet to see the opposite trend, from a specialist, can we get to a generalist? But I think, that might be possible.
And I'll maybe ask people, is GPT-4 a generalist model or a specialist model? Generalist? All right, specialist? All right, there's already a mixture here. I mean, I think there's this idea that if GPT-4 can be a doctor and it can also be a lawyer, then if I fine-tune it to become a better doctor, in our head, we're thinking it's going to become a worse lawyer. But maybe it can stay the same level of a lawyer and just get better at one thing. The common understanding is there's a trade-off. When we try to put in more data of a certain type, what's traditionally been the case is you lose your functionality, your ability on what you've maybe been pre-trained to do. How long this trade-off will hold, I simply don't know. Will this trade-off hold for larger models? I simply don't know. But my bet is it's little more a question of how the ecosystem will play out than how that technical trade-off will play out. Basically, if you have a data set that you can't share with me, but you've got a model that you'd like to build, charge me for API access, then we're getting into this ecosystem of specialists and an ecosystem where we will call these different tools that interact with each other through APIs, not by us putting all our data sets into one repository and letting OpenAI train it. And maybe that's how the future goes. Maybe we just all give our data to OpenAI, and OpenAI builds the next $100 trillion model, GPT-5, that's actually a specialist in law and a specialist in every single medical subspecialty. So I think it's a little more on the incentives driving the ecosystem than anything else right now.
I would land strongly on the side of we're going to see a situation where we have a generalist presiding over a bunch of specialists. That has happened pretty much every time you create an organizational structure. Across multiple cultures, multiple centuries, multiple continents, you never have a specialist presiding over generalists. It's always a generalist calling the shots over multiple specialists. The second thing is the incentives and the economics of things. If you need to solve a simple task, why would you pay the cost of RAM and compute of a trillion parameter model? If you care about sustainability, that is like a crime to use GPT-4 as a calculator. What? But think about it, right? I mean, on the one hand, we worry about climate change and carbon emissions and sustainability and stuff like that. And then we want to use this massive model to do simple things that you can do with your iPhone. So like what gives here? So at some point, market forces will drive pervasive use of generalists out of extinction. and there will be specialization, and then reduction to hardware maybe even, so that you can do it fast and cost effectively and with a sustainable footprint. Send both of them down. Reset.
Okay, so we're already out of time, but maybe just one last question. So it's about validation of these models. So definitely for specialist models, it's very easy. We have clear-cut metrics showing that they can do better than experts, but the more generalist the model becomes, the harder it is. And as we see here, we often rely on the human evaluation. And so, okay, first question is like, how do we make this scientific in the sense that for FDA approval, these kind of things, we need some scientific metrics. So can we use human evaluation? And if we can't, what can we use? And the second question is bouncing back on what you mentioned earlier, that we always focus on average performance rather than worst case performance. So for things like approval, like formal approval, which metric should be more important, worst case or average case?
So my answer, I actually gave the answer to this question that I don't know. So my answer to this question was that I don't know. I know that it should be a lot of development for benchmarking and the way that we are evaluating this model. But definitely the answer is not clear to me, at this point. Some of it's gonna get clearer when we clear the data and the application that we want to target. Definitely we won't jump to generalist model in just one step. Maybe we're gonna have multiple steps that we are looking at different application and the interplay of those applications. So it's just more clear that what are the metrics that we need to look at. But I think at this point, any speculation is just maybe baseless, and it needs more study. Yeah.
Okay. So how do we know we've succeeded? I guess when a new biological mechanism is drugged and passes phase 2 trials. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is a hard question. When is... Yeah, oh gosh, I don't want to get this debate again about phase 2 versus phase 3. But I think we will have arrived when we hold AI methods to the same standard as we hold scientists. So that is, if you can get a paper published, if you can get a medicinal chemist to make your molecule and test it, if you can get, launch a drug campaign off of a mechanism proposed from AI, that I would say if you, just like in our work with Philippe, when the proposed synthesis and approach was the same as what an organic chemist would do, then we know we've made it. That's really not scalable, and it's a difficult thing to evaluate, but I think that's the metric. As far as worst case versus average case versus best case, my background is more in chemistry, and there we are interested in the best things, the remarkable things, right? So if we have a model which can propose the best catalyst, we only need it once. We don't need to see patients and do a good job every time. So in my field, I think getting, finding the best is the most important metric, or average.
On top of what has been already said, I think the evaluation, the metrics are actually also still tricky for several specialist tasks. I mean, yeah, it's a really hard question. How do we evaluate a generalist model? But as soon as you look into very specialist tasks that are difficult, that require an expert to do consistently over time, how do you evaluate that? The definition of metric, I don't think that's straightforward. If it was, then probably we could build a model to surrogate to some sort of surrogate to proxy the expert. But it's just not one-dimensional even for a specialist task, many specialist tasks, and it's hard to define.
Who here trusts their doctor? Not a big show of hands. The MD doc. I think one model you can use for evaluating generalist models is look to drugs, and we have trials and we look at improvement in outcomes with these models. But imagine if we did that for our residents, to say, okay, to graduate medical school, we're now going to do a trial where for 6 months you're going to evaluate patients. We're going to look at what would have happened to similar patients without you evaluating them. It'd be ridiculous. It's a waste of resources. So I think we need to look more towards how we evaluate people in order to decide whether they should practice medicine. We have exams for that. There are ways in which that exam isn't representative of practice. So we have other exams that try to get us closer to practice. And then we have observations for 3 years under someone who's senior, where if there are mistakes that are made, they're corrected, the person learns, and by the time they are ready to practice independently, they've seen the variety of cases that they would encounter in practice. This is how we go about making doctors out of medical students. And I think we should start thinking about a similar framework for these models where it's clear that we're progressively over time just making them more and more secure by essentially marking how many times they have made errors by someone who's senior before we allow them to go out. And I think really thinking about them more as people, although there's going to be a lot of pushback on that idea, is much better than thinking of them as another drug that we have to pass through trials.
Yep, 100%. I was going to ask the question, how many of you have seen an FDA-approved doctor? I mean, it doesn't exist. So I think the apprenticeship model that Pranav is referring to, where for generalist AI, at least in healthcare, the model most countries have emerged towards is apprenticeship. You get sorted with a Jedi Master. You may like them, you may not like them. You suffer through 3 years, and if that person says you're good to go, you're good to go. For specialist things, at least in the US, there's 4 paradigms. You could be like a drug, you could be like a lab test, you could be like practice management software, or you could be like a medical device. 2 of these are FDA's jurisdiction, different departments of the FDA actually, drug and device. The other 2 are not FDA's business. One of them is ONC, Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, and the third one is CLIA, the Clinical Laboratories Information Act, regulated by pathologists. The reason I'm going into this much detail is even for things that are not AI, we have no idea how to regulate. It's evolved through tradition, culture, and so on. Like, why does the FDA division that regulates devices different from the one that regulates drugs? God knows why. Probably some politics way back. And so I think as we have these new technologies come on board, it's an opportunity. We can rethink our evaluation paradigms from scratch because it's moving so fast, nobody knows what to do. Instead of just shoving them into existing paradigms, I think there's a clear opportunity to make a fundamental advance in evaluating technology in a manner that's commensurate with its end use by examining its consequences. Maybe we do that in silico, maybe we do that with benchmarks, maybe we do that with observations, all of the above. But I think taking a consequentialist lens is probably going to guide us to the right path for how we evaluate these things.
Thanks a lot. So I've only got through half the questions, but it's time. And so let's call it a day and thank the speakers once again.